My name is Iain Boyd. I'm the director of our Center for National Security Initiatives here at the University of Colorado in Boulder.
Wonderful. And your research is very complicated sounding. So I'm hoping that you can explain kind of what you work on and then we can maybe talk a little bit about how it's especially relevant at the moment.
Yeah, so my main research area is on understanding what are called hypersonic vehicles. So hypersonic vehicles, they fly, through the air like airplanes, but super fast. So they're traveling at least a mile every single second. So if you try to picture that, that is really, tearing through the air. And so hypersonic vehicles, they are used for a variety of applications. So they're used by NASA to bring the astronauts back from the moon. When they land a rover on the surface of Mars, the vehicle goes through a hypersonic flow regime. And then hypersonics is in the news a lot these days because of defense and national security.
Can you tell me lately, are there topics related to current events and the war in Iran that you have particular knowledge on and maybe see from another perspective that you think might be helpful for other people to understand?
Yeah, I think, the war, the conflict in Iran, and this is true also in the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. For me, there's this very interesting sort of change in warfare going on right now. So I work on hypersonic systems. So hypersonic vehicles, in this context are hypersonic missiles. And hypersonic missiles are relatively new. They're very expensive. And so, the militaries around the world tend to have, 100 hypersonic missiles, let's say. So they're very exquisite, almost like silver bullet. You're going to use them very, very carefully for specific purposes. So on the one hand, that is kind of new. On the other hand, at the opposite end of the spectrum, armies are using very large numbers of, much less sophisticated, much less expensive weapons. And so these would be things like certainly drones are things that we've seen used a lot, but also organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah have used relatively low fidelity rockets. And so you have these two things going on at the same time. Right? You have the very expensive weapons that can probably are very difficult to defend against, but you can't afford to have very many of them. And at the same time, you have these unsophisticated weapons when they are used in their thousands, can also be very challenging, right, to defend against. So you have these two things going on at the same time, and it's just kind of interesting to see how that all plays out.
So, what are some of the benefits of the hypersonic missiles in warfare? I mean, being very fast, do they have the ability to be protected against, like, the Iron Dome and things like that in Israel? Can they protect themselves against hypersonic missiles?
Yeah, so hypersonic missiles are a thing because they are difficult to defend against. Part of it certainly is the speed. It just means that on the defensive side, you have less time to react. But these vehicles, they also fly in a part of the atmosphere where nothing else flies. So they fly higher than airplanes, but lower than spacecraft and satellites. And so most armies don't have radars and tracking devices looking at that part of the sky. And then the final thing that makes them difficult to defend against is that they are maneuvering all the time that they're flying. So, ballistic missiles have been around for decades and were, a major part of the Cold War. But ballistic missiles are very easy to kind of understand where they're going to go. Sort of high school math can tell you, once you've seen a ballistic missile, what its trajectory is going to be, because it doesn't maneuver; it just kind of flies like a cannonball. Um, but these new hypersonic vehicles, they maneuver all the way through their trajectory, which means you have to track them all the time. And again, that's not what the defensive side of these equations are used to doing.
When you say maneuver, are they being guided and their path can change?
Exactly. So they can go from side to side, they can go up and down. And, like I said, for a ballistic missile, once you've seen it, then you kind of know where it's going to go. But with a hypersonic missile, you have to continually keep your eyes on it, right, to see where it's going. And that is a key part of, of the U.S. administration's Golden Dome program, right? Golden Dome is designed to address a number of different new threats. One of them is hypersonics, and the challenge with hypersonics is, yes, you need to be able to, over thousands of miles, you need to be able to track, what these vehicles are doing.
Can hypersonics deliver nuclear weapons?
They could. And so, today China has hypersonic weapons, Russia and Iran have hypersonic weapons. The US is close to putting the first set of weapons in place. It's been reported that some of the Russian systems are what's called nuclear tipped. So they do have a nuclear warhead in them if those reports are true. So certainly, I think it's possible to put nuclear devices in these weapons.
In the recent months when there were missiles being launched, are there aspects of the coverage in the media that you think isn't being mentioned related to your work?
I would go back to what I was saying about this, distribution of low end and high end weapons. Right? You'll hear, I mean, there was a Russian hypersonic missile fired sometime over the weekend. That'll appear in the news. Iran reportedly fired a couple of hypersonic weapons at a distant US UK facility in the middle of the Indian Ocean. That was on the news, right? So it's almost like every single time a hypersonic weapon is fired, it's on the news a little bit. I think that, what's maybe missing, it's not really related to my research, but what's missing is that, these weapons are not really silver bullets, right? They're not ending the war, in either case between Russia and Ukraine, Iran and Israel and the US. In the end, these hypersonic weapons, they're new, and I think that's maybe why they appear on the news. But at the end of the day, they're just, another weapon in the arsenal that the military powers have at their disposal to try and figure out what to do with. So they're just part of the landscape now, I would say, of weaponry.
And what would you say and when you say in terms of the high-low weapons that are being used? Because it seems like the low weapons have done a lot of damage, right? And so, like, is it a combination of how they're used together that possibly could benefit one, side or the other?
Well, I think that's kind of what the next phase of warfare might be, which is exactly what you said, which is how do you use these different weapons that you have in your arsenal? How do you use them to best effect, right? And sometimes you might think, well, you could use the high end devices first. It's sometimes called knocking down the door, but basically you would try to, you know, inflict a lot of damage on your opponent so that you could then pursue the war with greater ease and more efficiency. At the end of the day, I think we will see, more and more different types of weapons. They all have to be used and synchronized. And I think this is where artificial intelligence, AI, is going to become very important too, right? This is very quickly going to get beyond the control, ability of people, right? If you have in the air at any one time hundreds or thousands of different kinds of weapons, it's not hard to imagine that that is, an application waiting to happen for AI.
Does Iran produce hypersonic missiles?
Iran does produce hypersonic weapons. They obviously have, by this stage, decades of, military technology development and buildup. They're quite sophisticated. And yes, they've used hypersonic weapons against Israel and some of the other states in the Middle East.
Do you also study, I guess, like laser weapons?
Yeah, no, exactly. So they're usually called laser weapons. They can be used for offense or defense. And
Mhm.
Israel has reportedly fielded a laser defense system. You know, those systems are the main asset or advantage they are often attributed as having is the idea of an infinite magazine, right? So if you imagine if you've got a gun, right, you've got a certain number of bullets, that's your magazine. You've got 12 bullets, that's what you've got, right? With a laser, the idea is that as long as it is plugged into an electrical power source, right, you can keep firing that thing, right, forever. Now, it's not quite true that it's infinite, but it's more cost effective probably than making missiles and making bullets and right and having to carry them around and so on. So high energy lasers are starting to be seen in the battlefield. And again, that's another example of what we were talking about, the kind of diversification of types of weapons. Lasers are in there too. And certainly for missile defense and Golden Dome, lasers being part of the picture has been discussed. That's probably, a little bit in the future, but is probably in the future for sure.
And what about kind of to protect against satellites or things in space? Are lasers being used for that too?
There certainly are known examples of lasers on the ground, what is called dazzling satellites. It's like shining a light right in your eyes, right? So if you have a satellite and its mission is to look at the Earth and take photographs and things, right? It is possible today to dazzle cameras and sensors on satellites with lasers from the ground. Can you shoot a satellite out of the sky with a laser? That's less clear, but there are, again, reports that both Russia and China are developing very, very large, high power lasers, which that might be one of the applications.
So, can you tell me more about what you're working on currently, or if there's research projects that you can share?
Well, these hypersonic systems are relatively new because they're quite complicated from the technology point of view. And the simplest thing to understand about them is because they're flying so fast, the vehicles themselves get super hot. And so you need special materials to basically make sure the spacecraft doesn't burn itself up. And so, when you see in the movies, astronauts coming back from the moon or from space, you see all this fire around the capsule, and so that's really what's unique about hypersonics. There's a lot of basic chemistry and physics and material science going on, and so in our research, we're trying to, evaluate and develop new materials to help better protect hypersonic vehicles, for example. And it involves, like I said, a lot of fundamental thermodynamics and chemistry, and just very, very different from regular sort of aviation and the kinds of airplanes that we all fly in.
Is there anything recent and maybe fascinating in your work or something that you have been around that you can share?
One of the main projects we're working on today is understanding how plasma forms around a hypersonic vehicle. So plasma in this sense is like electrons and ions, charged particles. And again, just going back to that movie analogy, that very often when coming back from space, there'll be a period of radio blackout when mission control cannot talk to the astronauts. And the reason they can't talk to them is because of the plasma that forms around like these hypersonic vehicles. It kind of is a shield against radio frequencies communications. So we have a relatively new project where we're trying to understand for first principles, well, how does this plasma form? At the atomic level, at the molecular level, how are the first chemical reactions occurring that first form the electrons and the ions that in the end lead to a radio blackout, plasma radio blackout? And so it's very fundamental and basic, but it also has an application, right? And that's really what I get excited about, right? It's kind of connecting very fundamental, sometimes abstract ideas, but in engineering, what we care about is their application.
Is it on the aircraft or no?
It's in the air around the aircraft. So,
Okay.
so the air around hypersonic vehicles gets heated to very high temperatures because of the speed.
Mhm.
And high temperatures, the air itself starts to break down into atoms and then electrons and ions. So there's a whole lot of different chemical activity, but it's in the medium around the air. The one way in which plasma a little bit can be felt is just static. If you sometimes you touch a door, especially in the winter, you get a little shock, right? That little shock is a form of plasma, and so in that way, you could feel it, but the hypersonic vehicle itself does not.
One question that I wanted to maybe go back and ask, from your perspective, what are security risks related to the Iran conflict?
Let's just look at it from the US perspective. The US has used up a lot of munitions in that engagement with Iran. And on its own, that's probably fine. But if you think about it from China's perspective, for example, the danger is, the risk is that China may see this as an opportunity to do something that's been kind of building up to do for a while now, which is Taiwan, right? And so there has been speculation that 2027 is the year that China will act on what they've been saying. And that was before the Iran conflict. It takes years to replace, missiles, right? And so whatever the US has fired over the last few months will take years to replenish, almost certainly. So I think that's, a risk. At the same time, I would also say US military leadership would say that they have been battle hardened. They've learned a lot of things from this conflict with Iran, whereas China hasn't really fought a hot fight in many decades, maybe 50 years. So everything's warfare, right? There's pluses and minuses. And so today, the US arsenal is lower than it should be.
Do you worry about missiles hitting the US at some point?
Well, that is part of, again, what lies behind Golden Dome. I think there is a need to better protect the US homeland against missiles. It only takes one country with a leader who's dangerous, right? To say, go ahead and fire missiles against the US, right? And so an example that might be North Korea. North Korea is getting very close to being able to send missiles against the US. So we need to be protected, right? And but it's also a very challenging problem because these missiles could come from East Asia, they could come from Russia, not today from Iran, but from many different parts of the world, unfortunately. So I don't worry about it, but I'm glad that as a nation we're starting to try and address that problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. I really appreciate your perspective and knowledge in this area and to help me understand a little bit more about a very complicated topic.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.